The Parkins family was, by all appearances, a typical suburban household. They lived in a spacious, well-kept home in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors and life seemed to move at a pleasant, unhurried pace. The head of the household, Robert Parkins, was a 50-year-old investment banker who had built a successful career over decades of hard work. Robert was known for his sharp mind and calm demeanor, qualities that had served him well in his profession. He was a man who valued stability and order, traits that extended into his personal life as well. Karen Parkins, Robert's wife, was 48 years old, a woman who had spent most of her life caring for her family. Karen had married young, just out of college, and had devoted herself to being the supportive wife and a loving mother. Though she had once been full of energy and dreams of her own, years of playing the dutiful housewife had left her feeling unfulfilled. The passion that had once burned brightly in her marriage had faded long ago, replaced by a comfortable, but ultimately unsatisfying routine. Despite her growing sense of discontent, Karen maintained her role with grace. She was an attractive woman, well-dressed, and always put together, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hinted at the emotional void she felt. She loved her daughter Emily deeply and took pride in the young woman she had become. But as Emily grew more independent, Karen found herself increasingly alone. Emily Parkins, the couple's only child, was a 26-year-old woman with a bright future ahead of her. She had recently completed her master's degree in architecture and was beginning a promising career at a prestigious firm. Emily was intelligent, driven, and full of life. She was the kind of person who drew others to her with her infectious enthusiasm and warm personality. Her relationship with her parents was close, particularly with her mother, whom she adored and admired. Emily's life had taken a turn for the better when she met Clint Fasserman, a 28-year-old engineer working at a leading tech company. Clint was everything Emily had ever wanted in a partner: handsome, charming, and intelligent. He had a quiet confidence about him that put Emily at ease, and they quickly fell in love. Their relationship was one of mutual respect and support, and Emily often spoke of how lucky she felt to have found someone like Clint. Clint, on the other hand, was not as perfect as he seemed. He had grown up in a troubled household, with parents who had divorced when he was still a child. His father had been absent for most of his life, and his mother had struggled to make ends meet. This tumultuous upbringing had left Clint with deep emotional scars. He had a desperate need for approval and validation, often seeking it from older, more authoritative figures. These insecurities were buried deep within him, hidden beneath his polished exterior. When Clint and Emily's relationship became serious, Emily decided it was time to introduce him to her parents. She wanted them to know the man she loved, and she hoped they would see in Clint what she saw: a caring, dependable partner who made her incredibly happy. Clint, too, was eager to make a good impression on Emily's family. He knew how much they meant to her, and he wanted to show them that he was worthy of their daughter's love. Emily was nervous but excited as she prepared to introduce Clint to her parents. She had spent weeks planning this evening, wanting everything to be perfect. Emily believed that this moment was crucial. Her parents' approval meant the world to her, and she wanted them to see Clint as the man she intended to spend the rest of her life with. Clint, for his part, shared Emily's sentiments. He had rehearsed what he would say, hoping to make a positive impression on the people who had raised the woman he loved. The evening arrived, and Emily and Clint drove up the winding road to her parents' home. The Parkins residence was a grand two-story house with a perfectly manicured lawn and an inviting warmth that could be seen from the lights glowing through the large windows. Emily felt a sense of pride as they approached the house. This was where she had grown up, a place full of happy memories. When they arrived, Karen greeted them at the door with a welcoming smile. She was dressed elegantly, as always, in a simple but stylish outfit that accentuated her natural beauty. Karen immediately hugged Emily and then turned to Clint, her eyes scanning him with a curious, almost appraising look. "Clint, it's so nice to finally meet you," Karen said warmly, extending her hand. Clint shook her hand firmly, feeling a slight unease under her gaze, but he smiled politely. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Parkins. Emily's told me so much about you," Clint replied. Emily's father, Robert, appeared in the hallway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was a tall man with a strong presence, and his stern expression softened as he approached them. "Ah, you must be Clint," Robert said, offering his hand. "Good to finally put a face to the name." Clint shook Robert's hand, noting the firm grip and the way Robert studied him with sharp, assessing eyes. Despite his calm demeanor, Clint could sense that Robert was a man who didn't miss much. He knew he had to win over this man, not just for Emily's sake, but to secure his place in this family. As they moved into the living room, Karen and Robert made Clint feel welcome. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, with Karen making sure that everyone was comfortable, offering drinks, and bringing out appetizers she had prepared. Emily watched her parents interact with Clint, feeling a sense of relief as the conversation flowed easily. Robert and Clint found common ground almost immediately. It turned out that both men shared a passion for model airplanes. Clint had mentioned his hobby to Emily in passing, but he hadn't realized that her father was also an enthusiast. The two men quickly became engrossed in a discussion about the intricacies of building and flying model planes, their conversation filled with technical jargon that left Emily and Karen smiling at each other, happy to see the men bonding. Karen observed Clint closely throughout the evening. There was something about him that intrigued her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. He was polite, well-spoken, and clearly adored Emily. But there was a depth to him, a hint of something more beneath his charming exterior. Karen, who had spent years reading people as part of her social obligations, found herself curious about what lay behind Clint's calm, confident facade. As dinner progressed, the conversation remained lively. Clint charmed both Robert and Karen with stories of his work and his upbringing, sharing just enough to be open but not too much to seem overbearing. Emily, sitting beside him, felt a warm glow of pride. This was exactly how she had hoped the evening would go. However, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that Clint's attentions occasionally lingered on her longer than necessary. When their eyes met across the table, there was a fleeting moment of connection that startled her. Karen quickly dismissed the thought, chalking it up to her imagination. After all, Clint was Emily's boyfriend, and she was simply an older woman, the mother of his girlfriend. There was nothing more to it than that, or so she thought. The evening ended on a high note, with Emily feeling elated that Clint had been so well received by her parents. As they prepared to leave, Robert clapped Clint on the back, telling him that he looked forward to seeing him again. Karen hugged Emily tightly, whispering that she was happy for her and that Clint seemed like a wonderful man. As Clint and Emily drove away, Emily's heart was full. She felt that everything was falling into place: her career, her relationship, and now her family's acceptance of Clint. She had no idea that the seeds of something far more complicated had been planted that evening, something that would eventually tear apart the very happiness she was now reveling in. Clint gradually became more integrated into the Parkins family. His frequent visits to the Parkins home became a regular part of the household routine. Emily often brought him along for family dinners, weekend barbecues, and even on small outings to the local park. He fit in well, effortlessly blending into the dynamic of the family. Robert, who was initially a bit reserved, warmed up to Clint more and more, especially as they bonded over their shared love for model airplanes. The two would often retreat to Robert's study, where they would pore over blueprints and discuss the latest advancements in model aircraft technology. It was a rare connection that Robert hadn't found with many people, and it made him appreciate Clint all the more. Karen observed all of this with quiet interest. She had always been protective of Emily, wanting the best for her only daughter. Initially, Karen had been pleased with Clint's presence in Emily's life. He was responsible, kind, and appeared to genuinely care for Emily. However, Karen couldn't help but notice that Clint had a certain charisma, a magnetic charm that seemed to draw people to him. It wasn't just Robert who had been captivated. Karen herself found Clint's company increasingly enjoyable. There was a certain ease with which he carried himself, a confidence that was both appealing and disarming. One chilly winter afternoon, the Parkins family decided to go for a walk in the snow-covered park near their home. The ground was blanketed in a soft layer of snow, and the trees stood bare against the overcast sky. Emily and Clint walked ahead, their laughter echoing through the quiet park, while Karen and Robert followed at a leisurely pace. As they walked, Karen watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and a hint of melancholy. Emily was growing up, and soon she would be building a life of her own, possibly with Clint by her side. Karen couldn't help but feel a pang of loneliness at the thought. As they neared a small hill, Emily ran ahead to challenge Clint to a race. Laughing, Clint accepted, and the two sprinted up the incline. Karen watched them, smiling, until she noticed that the ground beneath her feet was slick with ice. Before she could react, Karen felt her feet slip out from under her. Time seemed to slow as she fell backward, the icy ground rushing up to meet her. But just as she braced herself for the impact, strong arms caught her. Clint had turned just in time to see Karen slip, and without thinking, he had dashed back to catch her. He held her steady, his hands firm around her waist, pulling her back to her feet. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Karen felt an unexpected jolt of electricity pass between them. She thanked Clint for his quick reflexes, her voice steady, but inside she felt a strange flutter of emotion that she couldn't quite place. From that day on, Karen found herself thinking about Clint more often. It wasn't just the fact that he had caught her. It was the way he had looked at her, the way his touch had lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. Karen tried to dismiss these thoughts, telling herself that she was simply grateful for his help, but the feeling persisted. As winter turned into spring, there were more moments when Karen and Clint found themselves alone together. Sometimes it was just a quiet conversation in the kitchen, while Robert and Emily were in another room. Other times, it was a chance meeting in the hallway or on the porch when Clint arrived early for a visit. Each encounter left Karen feeling more conflicted. She began to notice little things about Clint that she hadn't before, the way his smile seemed to light up a room, the warmth in his eyes, the subtle strength in his movements. Karen knew that these feelings were inappropriate. Clint was Emily's boyfriend, and she was a married woman. But the more she tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. She found herself looking forward to his visits, her heart quickening whenever he was near. It was as if a part of her that had long been dormant was awakening, a part of her that craved attention, excitement, and the thrill of the forbidden. This newfound attraction was confusing and exhilarating all at once. Karen was torn between her loyalty to Emily and her growing desire for Clint. She couldn't understand how she had allowed herself to reach this point, but the thought of resisting seemed impossible. Clint, for his part, seemed to sense the shift in Karen's behavior. He became more attentive, more present in their interactions, and Karen couldn't help but wonder if he felt the same spark that she did. One afternoon, when Robert was away on a business trip and Emily had gone to visit a friend, Karen found herself alone in the house with Clint. He had stopped by to drop off a book that he had borrowed from Robert, but Karen knew that this was just an excuse. The moment she opened the door and saw him standing there, she felt her pulse quicken. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that something was about to happen. Karen invited Clint inside, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. They made small talk in the kitchen, but the air was thick with tension. Clint leaned casually against the counter, his eyes never leaving Karen's. She could feel his gaze on her, the heat of it making her skin tingle. Karen tried to keep the conversation light, but her mind was racing, her heart pounding in her chest. As they talked, Clint moved closer to Karen, closing the distance between them. The kitchen suddenly felt very small, the space between them shrinking with each passing second. Karen could feel the warmth of his body, the intoxicating scent of his cologne filling her senses. She knew she should step back, put some distance between them, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Clint reached out and lightly touched Karen's hand, his fingers brushing against hers. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. Clint's eyes were dark with desire, and in that moment, Karen knew that there was no turning back. The forbidden attraction that had been simmering between them for weeks had reached its boiling point. Without a word, Clint stepped closer, his hand sliding up Karen's arm, sending shivers down her spine. Karen felt as though the world had stopped around them. the only sound the pounding of her own heart. She couldn't resist any longer. The desire that had been building inside her erupted, and before she knew it, she was leaning into Clint, her lips brushing against his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them testing the waters, but it quickly deepened. Clint's hands moved to Karen's waist, pulling her closer, and she felt herself melting into him. The kiss was everything she had imagined and more: intense, passionate, and completely intoxicating. Karen felt a rush of emotions, a mixture of guilt, exhilaration, and a deep primal need that she hadn't felt in years. Clint lifted Karen onto the counter, his hands moving over her body with a possessive urgency. Karen's mind was a blur, her thoughts drowned out by the intensity of the moment. She clung to Clint, her fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting more. It was as if all the tension, all the longing they had suppressed, had been unleashed in a wave of uncontrollable passion. They moved from the kitchen to the living room, their kisses growing more desperate, their movements more frantic. Karen's clothes were discarded along the way, each piece falling to the floor as they made their way to the couch. Clint's hands roamed over her body, exploring every curve, every inch of her skin. Karen felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, every touch igniting a fire within her. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room as they became lost in each other. Karen felt as though she was floating, her senses overwhelmed by the pleasure Clint was giving her. Every touch, every kiss, every movement was like a drug, and Karen was completely addicted. She had never experienced anything like this, not even in her younger years, and the intensity of it took her breath away. Eventually, the intensity of their passion began to wane, and they lay together on the couch, their bodies entwined, breathing heavily. The reality of what they had just done began to settle in, but neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions, but neither Karen nor Clint dared to break it. They both knew that their relationship had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. Karen stared up at the ceiling, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. She knew she should feel guilty, and she did, but there was also a deep sense of satisfaction that she couldn't ignore. Clint had awakened something in her, something that she hadn't realized was missing. But now that it was there, Karen wasn't sure she could let it go. As they finally rose from the couch and began to dress, the tension between them remained, but it was different now. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no undoing what had been done. Clint kissed Karen one last time before he left, a lingering kiss that promised more to come. Karen watched him go, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened, but also with the anticipation of what was yet to come. One evening, Karen and Clint had planned one of their clandestine meetings at a small, out-of-the-way motel. Clint had rented the room for the night, and Karen had told Robert that she was meeting an old friend for dinner. She arrived at the motel with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and fear. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but the pull of her desire was too strong to resist. Excusing herself, Karen slipped into the bathroom to change. She stared at herself in the mirror, taking a deep breath as she unclasped her bra and pulled on the delicate lingerie. The black lace clung to her curves, accentuating her figure in a way that made her feel both vulnerable and powerful. She adjusted the garter belt, carefully fastening the stockings to it, and smoothed down the lace bodice. When she was finished, she stepped back and took in her reflection. Karen hardly recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked different, sexier, more confident, more alive. The years seemed to melt away as she ran her hands over the soft lace, feeling a thrill of excitement surge through her. This was the Karen she had almost forgotten existed, the woman who had once been full of life and passion, before the years of routine and disappointment had dulled her spark. But now, with Clint, she felt that spark again, and it was burning brighter than ever. The night passed in a blur of passion and desire. Karen and Clint explored each other's bodies with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if they were trying to burn each other's images into their memories. Karen had never felt anything like it before. The way Clint worshipped her body, the way he made her feel like the most beautiful, desirable woman in the world. It was intoxicating, and Karen found herself craving more, needing more. As the hours passed and the night grew late, Karen and Clint finally collapsed onto the bed, their bodies spent but their minds still reeling from the intensity of their lovemaking. They lay together in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of their breathing as they came down from the high of their passion. Karen knew that she should leave, that it was only a matter of time before Robert would start wondering where she was. But she didn't want to go. She wanted to stay here, in this moment where everything felt right, where she felt alive. Meanwhile, Emily also noticed subtle changes in her mother's behavior. She had always been close with Karen, confiding in her about her relationship with Clint and seeking her advice on various matters. But now her mother seemed different, distracted, almost as if she was hiding something. When Emily would ask her mother about her day, Karen would brush off the questions with vague answers, avoiding any real conversation. Emily began to worry, but she couldn't quite put her finger on what was wrong. Clint, on the other hand, was doing his best to maintain his relationship with Emily while juggling his illicit affair with Karen. He still spent time with Emily, going on dates and making love to her as he always had, but there was a certain distance in his eyes that Emily couldn't ignore. She noticed that Clint was more tired than usual, often citing work as the reason for his fatigue. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Clint's disappearances became more frequent, and he was less forthcoming about where he had been or what he had been doing. The growing tension in the household was palpable, and Emily found herself increasingly on edge. She began to question Clint more often, asking him about his late nights and his sudden need to work extra hours. Clint would always smile reassuringly, telling her not to worry, that he was just trying to get ahead in his career. But Emily wasn't satisfied with his answers. She couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach that something was terribly wrong. One evening, after Clint came from work and went to the shower, she noticed that Clint had left his work phone on the kitchen counter. It was unusual. He was always so careful about keeping it with him. The phone buzzed with a new message, the screen lighting up briefly. Emily's heart skipped a beat when she saw her mother's name flash across the screen. The message preview showed nothing more than a single heart emoji, but that was enough to make Emily's blood run cold. Why was her mother sending hearts to Clint's work phone? Her mind raced, and despite the turmoil within her, she felt compelled to know the truth. Trembling, Emily picked up the phone and unlocked it, her hands shaking as she navigated to the message thread. What she found there was beyond anything she had imagined. The screen was filled with messages between Karen and Clint, messages that were far from innocent. There were confessions of love, plans to meet in secret, and most disturbingly, intimate photos of her mother, dressed in provocative lingerie that Emily had never seen before. Some photos were taken in Clint's apartment, others in a hotel room. And there were photos of Clint as well, in equally compromising situations. Emily's world came crashing down around her. She felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath her feet, leaving her in free fall. Tears blurred her vision as she scrolled through the messages, each one a dagger to her heart. How could they do this to her? How could her mother, the person she had always trusted, betray her in such a vile way? Overcome with emotion, Emily sank to the floor, the phone slipping from her hands. She began to sob uncontrollably, the pain of betrayal overwhelming her. She couldn't understand how this had happened, how the two people she loved most in the world had conspired to hurt her so deeply. When Clint emerged from the shower, he found Emily sitting on the kitchen floor, her face buried in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. At first, he was confused, but when he saw his work phone lying next to her, the screen still displaying the incriminating messages, his heart sank. He realized immediately what had happened. Clint tried to approach Emily, but she recoiled, her eyes filled with hurt and anger. She began to mutter through her tears, questioning him in a voice that was broken and desperate. She asked him if it was really her mother, if this was really happening. Clint, caught between guilt and panic, could barely find the words to respond. He knew there was no excuse, no explanation that could make this right. Emily's heart was shattered into 1,000 pieces. She had trusted Clint, she had loved him, and now everything she believed in was crumbling before her eyes. The betrayal was too much to bear. and she couldn't stand to be in the same room as him. Before Clint could stop her, she jumped to her feet and ran out of the house, her tears blinding her as she fled. Clint hurriedly threw on some clothes and rushed out after her, but by the time he reached the street, Emily was gone. The night was dark, and there was no sign of her anywhere. He called her name, his voice echoing in the quiet neighborhood, but there was no response. Emily had disappeared into the night, and Clint was left standing alone, filled with dread and regret. Back inside the house, Clint frantically tried to call Emily, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He began to panic, not knowing where she could have gone or what she might do. Desperate, he called Karen, his voice trembling as he told her what had happened. Karen, who had been basking in the afterglow of their latest tryst, was stunned into silence when Clint told her that Emily knew everything. Karen's mind raced as she tried to process the news. Her daughter knew about the affair. The thought terrified her. She had never intended for Emily to find out, never intended to hurt her in this way. But now, everything was out in the open, and she had no idea how to fix it. Clint and Karen spent the rest of the night in a state of panic, trying to reach Emily, but to no avail. She wasn't answering her phone, and there was no sign of her anywhere. They both knew how fragile Emily could be, and the thought of what she might do in her current state of mind filled them with fear. By morning, there was still no word from Emily. Clint and Karen were both exhausted, their nerves frayed. As they finally decided to go to the police, they had no choice but to report Emily missing, hoping that she had simply gone to a friend's house or found some place to cool off. But as the hours turned into days, their hope began to dwindle. Over the next 3 days, the police scoured the city. They visited hospitals, combing through patient lists in case Emily had been admitted under an unknown condition. They checked into hotels, motels, and other lodgings, hoping she might have taken refuge somewhere to escape her anguish. Every lead, every potential sighting, was followed up with meticulous attention, but each one led to a dead end. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed, but no one had seen or heard from Emily since the night she fled her home. The uncertainty weighed heavily on Clint and Karen. Both were consumed by guilt and fear, unable to sleep or eat as they waited for any news, praying that Emily would be found safe. But with each passing hour, hope began to dwindle. Then, on the 3rd day after Emily's disappearance, the search took a tragic turn. A man walking his dog near the river stumbled upon the lifeless body of a young woman, partially concealed among the reeds along the water's edge. He immediately called the police, who quickly arrived at the scene. The description of the body matched that of Emily Parkins. When the police informed Clint and Karen, their worst fears were confirmed. The body found by the river was indeed Emily's. The discovery was a devastating blow, shattering whatever faint hopes they had clung to. Emily, unable to bear the betrayal and heartbreak, had ended her life in the most tragic way possible. According to the investigation, on the night she ran away from home, she walked for several hours near the river. Then, in great grief, she climbed onto a bridge that was 23 meters high from the river and jumped off it. Carried away by the shadows, she drowned, committing end of her life. After the tragic death of Emily, the lives of Clint and her parents were irrevocably shattered. The guilt and sorrow that followed her suicide became an overwhelming force that neither Clint nor Karen could escape, and it marked the beginning of a dark chapter in their lives. Karen, once a vibrant and confident woman, was consumed by despair. The reality that her affair with Clint had contributed to her daughter's death was a burden she could not bear. The guilt gnawed at her relentlessly, and she became a shadow of her former self. She distanced herself from everyone, even her husband, unable to face the world with the weight of her conscience. Karen's once strong marriage crumbled as the enormity of what had happened set in. Her husband, who had always trusted her, could no longer look at her without seeing the betrayal that had destroyed their family. Karen's mental health deteriorated rapidly. She sought solace in alcohol, numbing the pain, but it only deepened her isolation. Despite attempts at therapy, she struggled to find any sense of peace. The guilt was too powerful, the loss too profound. Eventually, Karen decided to leave the town where she had spent her entire life, hoping that a change of scenery might help her heal. But the memories of Emily haunted her no matter where she went. She lived the rest of her days in quiet despair, alone and remorseful, unable to forgive herself. Clint, on the other hand, was equally devastated by the consequences of his actions. The affair with Karen, which had seemed like a thrilling escape at first, had led to the most tragic outcome imaginable. Clint's life unraveled quickly. He was racked with guilt and tormented by the thought that his selfishness had driven Emily to her death. His career, which had once been promising, stalled as he found it impossible to focus on work. His reputation was in tatters, and he was shunned by friends and colleagues who had heard about the scandal. Clint tried to move on, but he was haunted by what had happened. The weight of Emily's death and the betrayal that led to it hung over him like a dark cloud. He moved away from the town, attempting to start anew in a different city, but the guilt followed him. Emily's father, who had been unaware of the affair until it was too late, was left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been shattered beyond repair. The loss of his daughter was a pain that never healed, and the betrayal by his wife was a wound that cut just as deep. He divorced Karen shortly after Emily's death, unable to stay married to the woman whose actions had led to such a tragedy. He buried himself in his work, trying to find some sense of normalcy, but his life was forever marked by the loss of his beloved daughter. He visited Emily's grave often, talking to her as if she could still hear him, seeking some form of solace in the face of overwhelming grief.